Hello and welcome to the instalment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Michael Dryden and Etches Adokru. Today, I am very pleased to say we are joined by Ryan Baldi. Ryan has written for BBC Sport, The Guardian, The Independent, amongst others, and is the author of The Dream Factory Inside the Make or Break World of Football's Academies. Ryan has joined us today to discuss his new book, the inspiration behind it, and his research, and we'll discuss the academy system in England. So Ryan, welcome to the show. A bit of context: Ryan's got his Boston Celtics top on this morning. Very apt for the episode. But how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm trying to represent the Celtics as much as I can with these podcasts that I'm doing. So good to get that mention in there. Thank you.
Yeah, good stuff. One of the first questions I like to ask all of our guests, because I always get it wrong. Do you follow a football team at all, Ryan?
No, not really.
Okay.
The team I look out for most would be Shrewsbury Town.
Shrewsbury Town.
I grew up in Shrewsbury, so
Okay.
around Shrewsbury, so they're kind of a local team I look out for.
I should know this because I'm in League One as a Sunderland fan, but are they League Two or League One? I think they're League
One.
Two.
Yeah.
League One. Oh God.
Mm-hmm.
So they're in your league, Dryden. So Ryan, we have an issue on the podcast where Dryden likes to immediately announce that he's a Sunderland fan as quickly as possible. That might be a record because we're about 35 to a minute seconds in, but
well, I've just exposed my League One knowledge.
You have.
Pretty early doors.
You have indeed. So Ryan, obviously I've skimmed quite a lot of The Dream Factory. I think it's really good so far. Honestly, I'm not just saying that. It's been exceptional reading it on my Kindle, which I haven't used before.
Thank you.
It's been a real good read. And one of the first questions I kind of have for you is, what was the inspiration kind of behind the book? Was it like a eureka moment, or was it something you've been thinking about for a long time?
It definitely wasn't a eureka moment because I can't really remember how it came about. So it must have been more of a gradual thing. I think it was just a general sort of fascination with young players. Really, I've always kind of been interested in finding out who the next kind of up and coming player is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
But then the natural extension of that curiosity is to think about how they come to be and the system that produces them. So yeah, I've always kind of been interested in academy football, more towards like the higher age groups of the players who were sort of knocking on the door of the first team and looking at who's coming up next. But the more you kind of look into it, the deeper you go and learn about the systems and things. So yeah, I'm not sure the exact moment the idea for the book came about, but I do remember thinking that fairly little is known about the ins and outs of the academy world. It seems like quite a closed off world. So I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to get the access that I needed to write this book. And it wasn't. I actually wrote about it at the end of the book. I wasn't sure it was doable essentially until I was kind of halfway through the day I spent with Crystal Palace at their academy. I remember just being stood at the sideline watching their under-18s train, seeing a ride-along lawnmower ambling past and just kind of looking around and thinking, okay, well, I'm in now. I've got as far as I need to get with this club. And maybe what I found was that I think the people who do the day-to-day work are quite proud of what they do and quite keen to show it. So that was kind of the real kind of moment that I realised this is doable and doors were starting to open. So yeah, that's the kind of early inception of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point of view where you just said about how the members of staff are really proud of their work, because reading through it, one of the burning questions I have was, obviously you're at multiple clubs, you spoke to multiple people, how did you actually get access? Because the academy world, I'm an Arsenal fan, I care quite a lot about Arsenal's under 18s, the 23s as well, but I think that it's shrouded in mystery. And I've always wanted to kind of know, as soon as I started reading it, how did you actually get access from those clubs? Were some more forthcoming than others? Was it quite easy to do, or was it actually quite difficult, did you find?
It was more, it was easier than I expected it to be. But there were still a lot of clubs. I've probably visited about a dozen clubs all up and down the country and at different levels. I would have asked to go to a lot more. I would have gone to a lot more if they'd have let me. But I think I got a good spread in the end. So I managed to get the likes of Man City, United.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Liverpool I went to, but also like down to Shrewsbury, who we mentioned a few minutes ago. Visited there. Kidderminster, who were a non-league club who are doing some really interesting things. Colchester, so it was a good spread, and that was kind of the main aim. But yeah, I was able to kind of get there by going directly to the people I was looking to speak to. I've built up quite a decent sort of book of contacts within youth football from just my general freelance work that I've been doing. I do a lot of sort of profiles of younger players where I go and speak to the coaches who work with them, figure out their journey and look at who they are as people more than as footballers. And often a good way to do that is to speak to the people who knew them before they were the superstars they've gone on to become. So I had a decent amount of contacts within the game, within the kind of youth football game. I learned on those. So that's how I've got a lot of the scouts that I spoke to, a lot of the coaches that I spoke to. I already kind of had some form of relationship with, and then kind of leaning on those people to help me put me in touch with others too. So one of the key interviews for the book was with Tony Whelan, who's Man United's assistant academy manager, is I believe his title. I spent about 3 hours with him. I went and had lunch with him. And he's kind of the star of the book because he's in his late 60s. He's been in part of United's youth system since 1990, I think it was. And he played for United in the 60s. He was the second ever black player to play for Man United.
Oh, wow.
He's a real respected figure, and he's kind of the oracle of this book in many ways. But I was able to get access to him because when I was at Burnley for the day, one of the coaches there just said, "Oh, have you spoke to Tony Whelan?" I said, "Oh, no, I don't know Tony." And he just gave me his number. I texted him, and we set it up. So it kind of snowballs once you get in at one place. You find, I always say in journalism and in the football world, I think like access begets success, and contacts beget contacts. So the more you have, the more you find yourself stumbling into. So yeah, it's kind of a snowball sort of thing with regards to being able to get the access that I got.
Yeah, I mean, I always assumed that football clubs would be incredibly difficult to penetrate, and even just I played quite a modest level of football as a kid, but sometimes had access to we played games at academies and co, and you'd get some exposure to coaches. I never played for an academy, but it always seemed super serious and professional. So I'd always assumed it'd be quite difficult to penetrate those circles from, say, your perspective. However, I mean, HS and I have discussed it before in previous podcasts. A lot of youth coaches, they don't get paid much. A lot of what they do is actually for a love of the game and a love of actually generating kind of players and helping young people. So actually, that actually resonates to what you're saying. As to these people are actually possibly very proud of what they do and are actually happy to tell the stories of not only what they do, but then the players they've helped bring up, not just through the footballing world, but then even, it's been in the press loads recently about Raheem Sterling, for example, coming from, very modest beginnings to then becoming superstars. So it resonates quite well.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think they're quite proud of their work for the most part, and I think the general perception of football academies is quite a negative one. So I think there's perhaps a bit of a desire to redress the balance a little bit. So they're keen to look at the good work they do, and there is a lot of good work being done, both in terms of football development and of kind of welfare and the development of the young people who the coaches are working with on a day-to-day basis. So I kind of wanted to explore all avenues. So there is a lot of negativity as well, which has been explored before, and I go into in great detail as well in the book. But some clubs and there are a lot of good people doing some really good work as well. So it's about the balance and it's about the direction of travel, I think, as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to look at.
Massively, I think, as I said, the book goes into such detail, as you said. And one of the themes which I picked up from it, which is kind of a buzzword for me, is eppp. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on it. So it's the Elite Player Performance Plan. For those of you that don't know, we did an episode on it literally a year ago. It's actually our second episode, which is a long time ago. But, I think there are loads of, beneficiaries from it. And I was reading in the book that, roughly it costs 3 to 5 million a year to develop a player. So when we see the likes of Bukayo Saka, Mason Greenwood, Marcus Rashford, play for their clubs, even though they're technically from the academy, and I think a lot of fans see them as free, there's so much money and investment that has gone into producing those players. Obviously, on the flip side, you get a lot of academies that sell their players for a lot of money, but the rigid structure of payments for these youth players, I think there's a mention about Jadon Sancho from Watford to Man City. Do you think what are your thoughts on eppp in terms of its overall inception, and do you think it actually serves a purpose only for the bigger clubs or the elite?
That's certainly what the smaller clubs feel.
Mm.
Because for those who aren't aware, the eppp system, the Elite Player Performance Plan, is a set of rules that govern English youth football for the top four divisions. Any club wanting to run a licensed academy has to abide by these rules. It dictates a lot of things. So, for example, you are graded. There are regular audits, and each academy is assigned a grade between 1 and 4, with 1 being the highest, which would indicate the kind of best staffing levels, the best facility levels, the highest investment, and then it trickles down to slightly lower ones. And there are kind of, I don't know if rewards is the right word, but there are benefits to being an academy, a Category 1 academy, whereby most clubs aren't allowed to recruit players under the age of 16 unless they live within a 90-minute radius of the training ground. Category 1 clubs from the age of 14 and up can recruit nationally, with the theory being that while that 90-minute radius rule is there as protection from children spending too much time on the road and the fatigue that can cause and what they might miss out on as a result, it's kind of the counterweight to it is the fact they'll be exposed to a Category 1 level of coaching, and it would be better for their development. So that's the theory behind that. And what eppp also dictates is a structured, prescribed payment system for transfers of young players. I mean, the idea of transfers for young players is an unsavoury notion in itself for a lot of people. I think I mentioned it briefly in the book. There was one a parent of a very high-profile young footballer I spoke to who didn't want to be quoted, didn't want to speak for the book, but he did refer to the system of transferring players and the youth system in general as child trafficking. He's got a lot of strong opinions, and that's something that has kind of been echoed in different ways from people I've spoken with. But yeah, the prescribed payment model gives each player a value from the age of from the under-9 level, when academies can first sign players to exclusive contracts from the age of 8 and up. Each player then is automatically assigned a value, which again is quite an unsavoury thing to think about. A 9-year-old having a price tag on their head. And then it's based on what level of academy they're training at and how long they've been training at that level. So a player who's been training who might be an under 16 who's been at a Category 1 academy since he was 9 might be worth a few £100,000 if another club wanted to come and sign them. If he'd been at a Category 3 for 1 year, he might only be worth 30,000 or whatever it might be. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it's all stipulated. It's all there. And what it's there to do is to avoid the need for tribunals and disputes, and having, I guess what it purports to do is stop players being caught in transfer wrangles. So if they want to move club, everyone knows that the price that has to be paid, so the selling club or the club losing the player are compensated, and that the player isn't caught in a wrangle and left in limbo. But a lot of the smaller clubs, as you mentioned, feel that it undervalues their players, and that it's easy then for the bigger clubs, the richer clubs, to stockpile, to come and hoover up talent at will, and hold them all as a big stockpile of talent. Because again, it's something I went into in depth in I think it's the 4th chapter, called the talent the talent arms race. I think I called it, because that's what it's like. It's like an arms race for talent at the top. The way that clubs are recruiting and are desperate to have the best players at younger and younger ages, because they're fearful of their rivals having them. So they want, if the next Kevin De Bruyne, if the next whoever you care to name, the next Mohamed Salah is there within this academy system somewhere, they want them as early as possible. So yeah, the smaller clubs feel that their players are liable to being poached away at younger ages for a fee that they don't feel is reflects true value. And I think that in a lot of ways is discouraging clubs below the very top level from running academies. That's why Brentford closed their academy.
Yeah,
they lost Josh Bowie and Jan Poveda. Probably not pronouncing that right. The Leeds player. No, he lost them one each to Man City and Man United. They said they only received £30,000 for each player, and they were both, I think, if not England youth internationals, then knocking on the door of that at the time. So they decided to close down the academy. So it's not a worthwhile endeavour for them. They saved themselves £1.5 million a year by just operating a B team model.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an interesting development to see whether eppp, as it stands, if it refuses to evolve at all, whether it will force more clubs to make that kind of decision and step away from the academy system as we know it.
It's such an interesting discussion. I think if you get the examples of where the success stories happen, it makes sense. So the idea that almost like this kind of mobility within the game, that a player from Sunderland, Joe Hugel, went to Manchester United for a pretty modest fee. I think probably 2 years ago now. However, he went on to actually do really well for the academy. So it's almost like, but as you said, because of the stockpiling, he could go into that system and just be an extra man that is essentially just making up the numbers for the ones that they expect to win or expect to come through, and therefore might actually never make it had they not just stayed at that initial club. So it's kind of a hindsight kind of element to it, but
I think I completely agree with your point, Dryden. I think one of the things you kind of alluded to just then was, do you think eppp will close more academies, or is it at a level now where we've seen the likes of Brentford, as you said, close and it's kind of plateaued? Or do you reckon as the years roll on, as you mentioned, it might evolve, we'll see more of them shut down?
Yeah, I think it seems to be moving in a way that more and more of the clubs without the big budgets are wondering whether it is worth it to them. But it's an interesting point of discussion because Brentford now run this B team model, which a few clubs are looking to replicate. Huddersfield being one of them. They now recruit players. They only have one team that sits below the first team of what they call their B team. They recruit players from sort of 16 to 19. And they believe every player they recruit now has a genuine chance of playing for their first team. So whereas before they would have had as many as 200 young players within their academy system, with only a fraction of those ever likely to appear for their first team, they were criticised at the point at which they closed their academy because it meant that they were releasing more than 100, I think, young players at the time, and they were criticised for the kind of heartbreak that caused. But the counterpoint to that, and I spoke to Huddersfield's former director of football for the book because they looked at Brentford's model and adopted it in large part, and his counterpoint was that, well, the initial heartbreak of releasing these players was something that it kind of a bitter pill to swallow. But in the long run, we're creating a lot less heartbreak because we're only recruiting these players who now have a genuine chance of making it through to our first team. We're not selling any false hope, which all academies do at the moment. So that would be Brentford's counterpoint. But if you take a step back and think about what if every team decided to only recruit players from 16 and up, Brentford and others who are following their example, they're still reliant on other teams training those players up to 16. These players aren't fresh to high level football at that age. They've come from somewhere. So if everybody decided, okay, well, we're only going to run a B team, we're only having players from 16 and up, who's training those players up to 16? It would be a complete kind of reboot of the model. Something else would have to fill that gap. It would go back perhaps to the old days of when schools football was the dominant force in English youth football, which kind of changed in the 90s or thereabouts. It used to be that teams couldn't sign players to formal contracts until they signed what they call schoolboy forms at 14. So up until the age of 14, it was all about schools football. The English schools FA was the predominant force in English youth football, which it no longer is, not for a long stretch, because again, it's something that I've done quite a deep historical element in the book where I look at the advent of the Charter for Equality in 1997, which really kind of formalised the academy system in this country. It's something that Howard Wilkinson, when he was FA technical director, was tasked with coming up with, and he drew up this academy system based off what he'd seen as examples from foreign clubs, so looking at Ajax and Barcelona and others, and decided that we need to empower the clubs to look after this system. So if they want to run an academy, they need to be running teams from the ages of under 9 and up. They need to have more contact time at younger ages, and that's kind of how the academy system came about in the late 90s. So yeah, what some of these clubs are now doing are stepping away from that and saying, we don't want to be a part of that. We don't think it's a worthwhile endeavour. We think it's a money pit if we're going to be losing players to bigger clubs. But yeah, like I said, if everybody does that, then who's training these? Does schools football become the dominant force again, because at the moment it wouldn't be equipped to provide the level of training that they'd expect. So maybe young players will start looking abroad earlier. So yeah, it's a really tricky question, because if we accept that the model as it is, it doesn't work, if eppp is too flawed to work for everybody, then certainly a B team model has too many holes in it to work for everybody as well. So there has to be some kind of middle ground, some kind of meeting in the middle.
And also Brentford benefit from being where they are, London based. They've got all these teams around them that are releasing these players. But actually, if you're somewhere in the southwest or somewhere in the northeast, there's only a handful of clubs around you. How do you pick those players off?
Yeah, exactly. They do where that competition was probably their Achilles heel for a while, because they were, surrounded by the likes of Chelsea and Arsenal, could all recruit from their same catchment. They now have that. They're there with a safety net for the players, or at least the handful of the better players who have fallen out from those academies now. But like you said, if somebody out in the sticks decides to do the same thing, who's ever going to want to go there? It's a really tricky thing to kind of think about.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on the point about Howard Wilkinson and what he did as a technical director, and also as well, with EPP coming in, England won the Under-17 World Cup in Goa, with the likes of Phil Foden starring, Jadon Sancho, Emil Smith-Rowe, who obviously I'm a big fan of, doing really, really well there. And the Under-19s have seen success. The Toulon tournament, they've seen success. And it kind of, do you think the current crop, is what I'm trying to allude to, has essentially benefited massively from this England's from the EPP plan, or has it been more of an effect of the England's DNA kind of plan, which kind of dovetails with it? We did an episode on that many moons ago. It was basically set up by Gareth Ainsworth, Gareth Southgate, and a few other people as well, to kind of refocus on England itself and how they could be successful as a national team, which hopefully, fingers crossed, we're beginning to see at an elite level, right? We're in the final of the Euros, which I'm going to mention another 20 times on the podcast. But do you think the current crop essentially has benefited from that EPP plan to get to where they are now?
Yeah, I think so. I think as much as it's sent a lot of players at a very young age, and they used to stockpile, and there are 12,000 just on the boys' side. There are around 12,000 boys in academies at any one time.
Wow.
And only a small fraction of those ever get through. And that's a result of what the Charter for Quality introduced, what EPP reinforced. But at the same time, it did increase contact time and coaching quality and staffing levels and facility levels within youth football. So the players who do get through, I do think, benefit greatly from it. So that's the kind of catch-22 when you look at the fact that we're now in the European Championship final. Does that justify the cost of it all, the human and the financial cost of everything that goes into creating these players? So it's it's a difficult thing to answer. I think, like I said, it's a very flawed way of operating. I don't think it's ever going to be right to have so many young people fed false hope and brought into a system that is going to discard most of them. I spoke to the Guardian journalist David Conn, who's done a lot of work in this area, and he said you've got to look at it from the opposite perspective. If this is a system that we accept and we know takes in 12,000 young boys at a time, and 90% of them don't get through, they get spat back out, and you can't look at it as a dream factory. You've got to look at it as a crushing of dream factory, because that's what it does. That's what they deal in predominantly. So you've got to, as much as developing players is going to be your priority, you've also got to look at how these young people are taken care of and how they're looked after, and to ensure that they don't kind of come back to earth with a bump when they don't get through. While there are certainly benefits, and I would certainly suggest that the rules that are in place have helped create a better standard of play, I think a lot of it is down to the clubs themselves as well, because they do have a lot of autonomy with how they operate within those rules. And there's a lot of innovation going on, and a lot of really high level work being done by the likes of Man City, who produced a Foden and did a lot towards Jadon Sancho's development, like United producing your Rashfords and Mason Greenwood, who's coming through now, and like Liverpool. I went into quite a lot of detail about the specifics of how Trent Alexander-Arnold was developed at Liverpool. I spoke to some of his coaches and kind of was able to paint a picture of what it was like on the training ground when he was going through his development from a midfielder into a right back, and the frustration that he had, and how he sent balls flying across the pitch of the academy with frustration at times, but they kind of had to get total buy-in from him, and how they'd have meetings with him and feedback to him about his progress, and kind of chart his path to becoming one of the best right backs around. So the work that's been done on the training field at each individual club has been really important too, and I think those coaches deserve credit for the success stories we're now seeing. So it's a combination of factors, like you said. There's the whole England DNA project. There's the EPP, and then there's the individual coaches and the individual clubs who are doing things in their own way, and doing what they think is best, and looking to other clubs and looking abroad at best practices, and adopting them. And it's difficult to say which of those factors is most responsible, because there's no real way of measuring it. But at the moment, it's kind of a confluence of all of them that's come together and produced a real quite incredible crop, really, when you think about it, especially of the younger players that are coming through. I don't think we've, certainly not in my lifetime, had the depth of technical players coming through that we've got at the moment.
I completely agree. In my short time watching England, I'm only 27, or as Dryden likes to say, I look around 50 sometimes. But I think when you see someone like Phil Foden, I wouldn't have imagined England producing a player like him 15 years ago. There are other examples as well, but I think it shows the change in the type of quality and the type of style of player that England are beginning to produce at these academies, which is obviously good, because you want to see the national team thrive, and you want to see them do really well. You touched on earlier about the evil side of these plans, and how rejection for young players isn't very good. And you talk about that in the book, actually, where you mentioned about the 90-minute journey and how they can recruit nationally. But one thing I didn't know was about the satellite venues that a lot of these clubs have, and the churn of players. And I think one of the questions I have to you is, are clubs trying to rectify this, or is it a problem which is getting worse in terms of hoarding youth players? Because I think you're right. There's one thing being rejected at 18 or 17 or 16. It's a long journey. But to say to a 10-year-old, when you've been told you're, the best of the best, it's still devastating for a young player. And the kind of question I have to you overall is, does more need to be done, essentially, with the hoarding of youth players?
Oh, absolutely. More needs to be done to that end, and with preparing them for release. I think that's a big thing. Kind of the feedback mechanisms are in place. It shouldn't come as a shock for any young boy or girl in an academy when they're released. It should be a gradual thing where there's constant sort of feedback and appraisal, and they're always aware of their progress, so that when the time comes that they are let go, they're not just kind of dropped out of nowhere, and it doesn't come as a shock to them, because that's something I found to be the case with a lot of people I spoke to, because I spoke to players themselves who've been released, and I spoke to the parents of the players who've been released, and it comes out of the blue sometimes. And what I found was that the game itself thinks it's a lot closer to cracking these problems than it really is. I spoke to the EFL's head of youth, David Weatherall, the former Leeds and Bradford defender, and he was saying about how there's proper feedback mechanisms in place at any club should be adhering to those, and that it shouldn't come as a surprise when any young player is released. But that's certainly not what I found anecdotally from the people I've spoken with. They don't feel that is always the case. With regards to stockpiling and having contact with younger and younger players, as I mentioned, clubs can't formally sign a player to an exclusive contract until they reach the under-9s level, which incidentally, a lot of the coaches I spoke to and a lot of the academy managers feel is too young. They would like to see that age raised to maybe 10 or even 12. But it is the way it is, and I think it's going to stay that way while this kind of arms race for talent that I mentioned is ongoing. What they do to kind of get around not being able to work with players and sign them until they're in the under-9s level is run pre-academies, and they have, like you said, they have satellite centres. A lot of clubs where they have an extra training base, maybe a bit further away from their central academy, which would extend their 90-minute radius. So, for example, Colchester, one of the clubs I visited, are a Category 2 academy. I think it's still the case there. in terms of the Football League ladder, they're the lowest ranked team to have an academy as high as a Category 2 level, and that's why I went to visit them and figure out what they're doing. What they do is try to bridge the gap between where they are and London by having a satellite centre in the middle, so they can kind of extend their radius to catch part of London and still be able to work with some of the London talent pool before they're allowed to recruit them formally at 16. And Chelsea are a club who have 11 satellite centres around London and the southwest area. So yeah, it enables them to kind of focus on sort of localized talent pools and get as many players through their doors as they can. And they'll start looking at them from like 5 and 6. They'll invite them for weekly sessions. I was able to, in one of the chapters, I looked very specifically about the process of releasing young players and what comes next for them, looking specifically at players kind of the really younger age groups in the foundation phase. When I was able to reproduce an email that was sent to a parent of a player from a Category 1 London club who was 7 years old at the time. He was playing for four Premier League clubs at the time because, like I said, there are no restrictions to, there's no exclusivity at that age, so they can train with whoever they want as often as they want. But there was one club in particular he'd been with, and the parent asked them not to be named because the boy still wants to kind of be in the system and follow his football dream, so he didn't want to burn any bridges. But he broke his leg when he was 7.
Oh, wow.
Playing for one of the teams as a session with one of these Premier League clubs. And of the 4 clubs that he was training with, only one really kind of kept in contact and asked how he was doing. The one he'd been with the longest, the one he first started training with when he was 4, as soon as he recovered from his broken leg, he went back to training with them. And within a few weeks, they released him. And they did it by email. And I was able to reproduce this email in the book because the dad of the player that in question kind of read it out for me word for word. And he was really shocked and disappointed by how impersonal it was. It was one of these kind of automated things where it's a boilerplate email, and you're supposed to infill the name of the person you're writing to, but they didn't do that. So it was just like this bracket parent guardian, rather than what you're supposed to delete and put in the name of the person you're speaking to, which they didn't bother to do. There was nothing specific to this boy in the email at all. It was all your child. Thank you for your child's attendance at our centre. At this stage, we don't offer specific feedback, but generally players can improve on this, and this. And I just felt it didn't relate to their experience in any way, and that he'd been with this club for the best part of half of his little life, really. He went through this real kind of traumatic experience of breaking his leg and coming back from that. And then as soon as he gets back and he gets playing again, without any indication that he was falling behind in any way, he was let go in a very, like I said, a very impersonal way. So that is one of the real sort of dangers of having a system that sweeps into it so many young people. Because the 12,000 number relates only to those who are signed to academies to exclusive contracts from the under-9s and up. So there are even more who are having access to these academies and satellite centres from younger ages. For example, I was really keen to speak to a couple of parents of kind of highly rated and highly sought after young players. And I was able to do that by speaking to Mason Mount's dad, Tony Mount, about his experience and Mason's experience being scouted by Chelsea and their journey to where he is now. And also Ryan Brewster's dad, Ian. Of course, Ryan Brewster was at Chelsea as well at a young age. Then he went to Liverpool, at Sheffield United. He was part of that under-17s team you mentioned, who won the World Cup a few years ago. He was the top scorer in that tournament. So he said that when they first went to Chelsea, when Ryan was 6, Ian, the dad, said that each week he noticed that there were a lot of unfamiliar faces. So the parents he saw the week before would be gone, replaced by a new set of parents. And he spoke to one of the coaches about it. And he said they basically kind of cycle through these boys to see which ones they're going to invite to their central pre-academy up at Cobham. And he said they might go through 350, 400 boys before they find the 12 or whatever that they're going to invite. That's the kind of level of attrition we're talking about. So yeah, it's ruthless and it's very impersonal because of the sheer number. I think that are being cycled through, and that's a really dangerous element too when you're seeing these young children discarded so freely. And like I said, I think the coaches are doing the day-to-day work for the most part, from what I've seen, are aware of their kind of responsibility to these young people as young people more than just as footballers. And there's some great people doing really great work, but the system itself is kind of rigged in a way that means that they're seen as numbers more than anything. So that is one of the kind of most worrying elements of it, I find.
I suppose it's the pressures between the pressures from the club versus the human element from the youth coach element. I mean, I never thought I'd use this club as a good example, but when go back to your point of preparing these boys, or when they get to say even to like 15, 16 level for essentially for professional football, there should be a greater kind of responsibility on these clubs. So I never thought I'd use this club as an example, but Chelsea, for example, a lot of stick has been put towards them around the whole loan system where they farm out 40 players on loan. But actually, I read an article in The Athletic not too long ago, and I think Izzy Brown was one of the players saying that actually, as much as I've got no doubt that Chelsea's main motive in that is possibly to make revenue from these players. You know, they loan them out, they sell them on for 2, 3, £4 million a pop. They make a lot of money. However, these players have still had experience out on loan. They're cared for, they're looked after by the club, and then they end up going on to have, at least a good professional career. Whereas perhaps compared to some clubs that don't do similar things or prepare these boys or these teenagers for professional football, they might get to 16 and 17 and actually not have a chance to move on because they've not had experience like a loan system or anything like that. So I thought that was an interesting example, even though I never thought I'd use Chelsea as a good example in this sort of context.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. For my first book, I interviewed a player called John Bostock. I don't know if he's someone you're too familiar with.
Yes, Palace boy, went to top.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. He was. I think he is still the youngest player ever to play for Palace and Spurs, because he debuted for Palace at 15 in the Championship, and the next year he went to Spurs and played for them at 16. I think he still holds both records. And I was just chatting to him, because his story was one that was a big part of my first book, the next big thing. And we just kind of, during the conversation, the idea of Chelsea's academy cropped up, and he pointed out that as from the perspective of a young player, you can look at it from the outside looking in. You might think, oh well, why would I go there? Because at the time, no one was getting through. It's changed a bit more recently with Mason Mount and Reece James and Tammy Abraham and a few others getting their chances in the first team. But up until that point, they had this really high performing academy. They were winning the Youth Cup every year, but none of the players were getting through to the first team. Like you said, they were being loaned out and they were being sold elsewhere. But John said that, well, yeah, you can look at it that way and say, why would I join this academy? But from from a footballer's perspective, you can look at it and think, well, they're obviously delivering a really kind of high level footballing education, and while they don't sort of have much of a pathway, they go quite a long way to guaranteeing a career within the game, perhaps more so than other academies, because while these players don't necessarily get through at Chelsea, they get through somewhere and go on to have pretty good careers. So yeah, that is one element to the loan system, and giving experience in the shop window to players. So although the likes of maybe Lewis Baker or someone would not have had any real shot at making it at Chelsea, he has had tangible first team experience. But I do think, it's kind of a byproduct of their stockpiling, isn't it? It's because they have so many players that they have to loan so many out or sell. And I personally would like to see something in place whereby you can only loan out a player so many times before you either have to sell them or they become a free agent or something, so they're not stuck in that cycle of being loaned until all of a sudden they're 25, 26 and they've never played for their parent club. They don't really know where they stand. But yeah, that's just a kind of personal thing that I think would be healthy for the game, which we're probably never going to see.
Yeah, to that point, actually, I've just got Izzy Brown because I was just double checking that point before, and Izzy Brown was actually loaned out by Chelsea on 7 occasions. So beginning at Vitesse, and his last one was at Sheffield Wednesday, and he only just joined permanently Preston North End in 2021. So this year, so yeah, to that point, he's had 7 loan spells from 2015 to this year, which is a bit crazy.
Yeah, I think there comes a point where it reaches a tipping point. I think initially it can be quite helpful to their development, but at a certain point when you're on your sixth and your seventh line, it's more about kind of treading water and not being able to progress and put down roots somewhere. Which I think there comes an age where a player really needs to kind of establish himself somewhere and not always feel like you're never going to know where you're going to be next season.
Yeah, very much so. I think, yeah, Chelsea, a really interesting example with the way their academy runs and the players, the sheer number of players that they do have. I think one of the questions which I've been dying to ask you is, what surprised you most during your research? Because I think we spoke about before we started the pod, right? Is that academy football is shrouded in mystery. Like there are kids you hear about 15 who are meant to be the next thing, and they're not. The inner workings of it is very hard to find a lot of information about. Like I'm dying to know about things about Arsenal's academy, or Tottenham's or Chelsea's, but it's shrouded in mystery. And what the question I wanted to ask you is, what surprised you most when you embarked on your research?
I think what surprised me most, and it was an encouraging thing, is just how much the coaches care. For the most part, the ones I spoke to certainly have a real eye on developing young people and their responsibility to those people. I mentioned Tony Whelan earlier. He was one who is really keenly aware of the responsibility of his role and the people he works with, their responsibility to the children and their care. At United, they have a philosophy that they call "right is might." It was coined by, I believe, Jim Ryan, the former youth coach at United. He was there a long time, very respected figure. And I spoke to guys like Tony Whelan, Colin Little, the under-18s coach, and Paul McGuinness, who now works for the FA, but was at United for a long, long time. Was a very, very, very respected coach within the game. And they talked about how this philosophy of writers might kind of guides what they do with their players, and it's been a real key driver in the development of the likes of Marcus Rashford, for example. So they don't wish to take any credit whatsoever for all the things we've seen him do over the last year and a half. But when you look at the things they do with their young players, you can kind of trace back some of the roots of what he's doing now. His kind of altruistic and charitable side, his sense of social responsibility was sort of fostered and nurtured within United's academy. Some of the things they do, for example, whenever they go on a trip abroad, because often from sort of 10 years older and up there, these young players are traveling to tournaments overseas, be that in the States or into continental Europe. What United will do, they'll encourage each of their players at different times to stand up and give a speech thanking their hosts and the hotel staff for putting them up. They'll provide sort of signed shirts and pennants and things for the staff that they work with. They do everything they can to make the people who are there hosting them to feel a big part of their team and to feel really appreciated. They make sure that the players clean their rooms, which doesn't sound like much, but they say that all the maids should have to do is come in and change your bed, and they shouldn't be picking things up off the floor. So you keep your room spick and span, and just generally kind of seeing them, encouraging them to think of others, be responsible in that aspect, and also teach them kind of cultural lessons. So they'll go somewhere to a city they'll visit for a tournament, and they want to make sure that these players aren't just seeing one set of AstroTurf pitches that could be anywhere in the world. They're going and exploring. Tony Wheeler used the example of when they went to Budapest, they went to Ferenc Puskás's tomb. They spoke to the tournament organisers about it and said that this is something we want to do. Can we make time for it? And lo and behold, all of the clubs ended up going because they were so inspired by the idea of going to see Puskás's tomb. And they taught them all about this player who scored against England in the famous 6-3 game at Wembley, scored in the European Cup final for Real Madrid, was one of the legends of the game. So they kind of teach them a bit of history, a bit of culture, make sure that while they're in the academy, they're there to train and to improve as footballers, but they're also going to have an enriching experience because they're aware that only a fraction of them are going to kind of have a career in the game. So they don't want to come out of it feeling like these children have lost their childhood or have given up more than they're getting back. So essentially, they want their experience within the academy to be an enriching one. So no matter the outcome for them or at what point their journey will end, they want them to feel, like I say, enriched by it.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the overall theme of what we discussed here is the well-being of these young boys and teenagers is actually what should be at the forefront rather than the commercial aspects of the game. But I think we'd be naive to think that the latter isn't important to extent and is present in the game. But I think the well-being of these boys is the key. So Ryan, I think we've reached our target time bang on. So brilliant, and thank you so much for coming on. As I mentioned at the start, the Dream Factory inside the make or break world of football academies is out now. Ryan, where can listeners pick up a copy?
All the usual places, Amazon, the usual booksellers. It's released on the 5th of August, but it's available for pre-order, and I'm told that pre-orders really help. So if anyone feels like they might be interested in it, please do consider checking it out and placing a pre-order for when it's released in a few weeks' time.
What I will say is it gets my seal of approval. I don't know how much that means to our listeners, but I really, Ryan, it's been a cracking read so far. There's 1,000 other questions I wish I could have asked you, but we've unfortunately run out of time. So pre-order if you can, guys.
Yeah, cheers. All right, then. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for coming on, and have a good one.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, guys.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.